Hello. Today I'll be talking about the conservation of orangutans in Borneo and Sumatra, and my name is Corbin Knapp. So, the three guiding ethical principles of the field of conservation biology are to document the full range of biological diversity on Earth, investigate human impacts on species, genetic variation, and ecosystems, and to develop practical approaches to prevent the extinction of species, maintain genetic diversity within species, and protect and restore biological communities and their associated ecosystem functions. The two that most apply to orangutans are investigating the human impact on them and their genetic variation, as well as their ecosystem. And our goal is to develop practical approaches to prevent their extinction while maintaining genetic diversity and restoring their ecosystem. For their trophic levels and biodiversity in Borneo and Sumatra, on the next slide, there is a example food web of Sumatra. But examples of primary producers in Borneo and Sumatra would be plants such as grasses, rambutan, palm ferns, and figs. Example primary consumers would be orangutans, Sumatran rhinos, and Sumatran elephants. Secondary consumers would comprise of clouded leopards and reticulated pythons. And finally, the tertiary consumer would be the Sumatran tiger. Examples of decomposers would be fungus, scavengers, and worms. The islands of Borneo and Sumatra are among some of the most biologically diverse habitats in the world. I would predict that both Borneo and Sumatra have the highest biodiversity, due to being located near the equator, with large rainforests being a climatic and geological feature on both islands. Genetic diversity is above average in both islands. Orangutans, however, do not have a high level of genetic diversity due to their low numbers, which results in a lower gene pool. In contrast, their habitat is both biologically and genetically diverse. Here's that food web. Habitat fragmentation and destruction. The indirect threats that affect Borneo and Sumatran orangutan habitat biodiversity are the logging and palm oil industries, international trade, transportation, roads, and commercial development. Direct threats that affect Borneo and Sumatran orangutan habitat biodiversity are overexploitation, climate change, habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, and habitat degradation. The main cause of these habitat destruction are the expansion of human populations and activities. Some examples of human population and activities affecting the orangutan environment is overexploitation, urban development, pollution, and climate change. Forest fires, logging, and palm oil industries are major threats to orangutan habitat in both Sumatra and Borneo as well. An example from the SOCP is that habitat fragmentation is another ever-present threat to orangutans. Simply cutting a road through the forest can cut an orangutan population in half, even if the forest on either side is largely left intact, because orangutans are very reluctant to leave the trees and cross open areas on the ground. This can render viable populations into two or more much smaller populations that are not likely to survive more than a few decades. For climate change and exploitation and invasive species, climate change impacts orangutans in both Borneo and Sumatra because their habitat will continue to change as temperatures increase. A major danger that might increase if temperatures continue to rise is wildfires. Extended periods of heat might cause wildfires to occur more frequently, further reducing the habitat of these creatures. The overexploitation of trees by the logging industry heavily affects orangutans because they rely on the trees to escape predators, and it is also their primary living area. The expansion of the palm oil industry has also furthered deforestation of the orangutan habitat. Logging is a primary threat, but other dangers that orangutans can face are being poached or captured for the illegal pet trade. An invasive species might negatively impact orangutans if the invasive species introduces a new disease to the population. If it is a predator, it might be a new threat to the orangutans. And even if the invasive species is not a predator or disease carrier, it might still compete with orangutans for food or contaminate their food. Invasive species have a disproportionate impact on an island compared to a continent, according to a source from Cambridge. Extinction risk. The extinction risks associated with the orangutans in Sumatra and Borneo are that the Borneo orangutan is considered endangered and the Sumatran orangutan is classified as critically endangered. Both species are considered to be in severe decline, and some factors that put orangutans high on the risk of extinction are their narrow geographic range, only one or a few populations, small population size, island habitats, large body size, and slow reproduction. A source from the IUCN states that the most recent population estimate for the Sumatran orangutan is 13,846 individuals, and the most recent population estimate for the Borneo orangutan is around 104,700 individuals. But these numbers are predicted to decline unless drastic action is taken to preserve the species. The conservation measures related to establishing and maintaining a population of orangutans would involve a reinforcement program for existing populations of orangutan, but also an introduction program for new habitats as well. These would follow the IUCN guidelines for reintroductions and other conservation relocations. Threat to the orangutans will be understood and addressed, such as logging and poaching. When looking for a new habitat for the orangutans, the ecology of the orangutans will need to be thoroughly understood in order to find compatible habitat for relocation. The genetics of orangutans and released individuals need to be sufficiently understood and monitored in order to invade inbreeding or a decrease in genetic variations. If the orangutans need to be relocated, there'll be enough viable habitats to support their populations. Ecological risks would be assessed and accounted for such that when reintroducing orangutans to their previous habitat or new habitats, there will be no risk of the orangutans damaging the ecosystem or other endangered species in the new habitat. Human concerns would be addressed by making sure local legislation would be met and local people would have their concerns addressed. Off-site facilities can also be constructed in order to address threats to species such as logging and poaching that were mentioned earlier, acting as a sort of midway point or safe zone for orangutans in order to buy time to research more on these animals and to relocate them to a better home. Indonesia has a more distinct approach to managing protected areas, and management falls to multiple different operations. This is a problem because protected areas are being managed by different operations, resulting in a disorganized management plan. Certain parks and other protected areas have workers that patrol areas of the park, and this results in different protected areas having different levels of protection. Another problem that the protected areas face are there are not a lot of park rangers available. That's because the protected areas are large and cannot be easily patrolled. Another problem is that some areas are more accessible than others. Because certain areas are accessible by humans, they may need greater protection than more isolated areas when there is less access. The biggest problem that the protected areas face are poachers, illegal mining, and logging operations that exploit protected areas that are not well monitored. Orangutans are protected under Indonesian law, but this species and their habitat has continued to decline even with protected areas being implemented. For habitat destruction and poaching, smart patrols are sent around the area to check for illegal activity in the protected zones, but the GLNP is a massive area that needs more manpower to patrol efficiently. The Indonesian government does not have the funds to hire more patrols and rangers, and a solution to this problem would be to hire volunteers to join the patrols or locals that are more interested in protecting the orangutans. For land management, 75% of the remaining orangutans in Indonesia live outside protected forests, often log forests and plantations, according to my source by Myhard et al. From 2010. These forests outside of the protected areas are a huge benefit to the conservation goals of protecting orangutans. Some strategies for satisfying both human needs and conservation interests will be necessary for the success of orangutan conservation plans. The land management involved in Indonesia would not qualify as ecosystem management because there is no coordinated plan for the area that is sustainable, includes biological, economic, and social components, and is shared over all levels of government as well as business interests, conservation organization, and private citizens. Adaptive management is also not being implemented effectively. The people-based efforts associated with orangutan conservation include community-based initiatives and on-site agricultural conservation. An article published in the Journal of Applied Ecology gives examples of how local Indonesian farmers were moving away from more aggressive means of protecting their crops from raids by the orangutans and more towards on-site management that is less aggressive and does not harm the animals. For ecosystem restoration, the areas of ecosystem that we need restoration now and in the future to benefit the conservation goals associated with orangutans are the peat forests in the lower areas of the islands and the rainforests higher up in the mountains. The challenges of restoring these areas are that much of it has been cleared for the logging and palm oil industries, leaving little original habitat behind. The restoration approach that should be applied is the partial restoration approach. The species benefits of partial restoration are that cleared areas can be replanted with trees needed for orangutan habitat. Hopefully then orangutans would gradually be reintroduced into the restored area, and some ecosystem service that would be provided because of the restoration would be the regulating services that forests provide. For conservation policy and funding, there are conservation policy involved with the orangutans, one of which is the Orangutan Land Trust, but these conservation policies are a rough foundation and could be improved on. The sources of funding for conservation associated with the Orangutan Land Trust are several non-government operations that the organization partners with, but more funding could be allocated to the organization in order to increase their ability to meet their goals of finding new sites for orangutans, protecting orangutans, educating people about orangutans, creating wildlife corridors, restoration, etc. So finally, some solutions to the major conservation problems that orangutans face in both Borneo and Sumatra. Number one is the habitat loss, fragmentation, and the overexploitation. Solutions to these problems would be implementing laws that permit leases to be purchased in order to harvest trees and use rangelands. Taxes should also be implemented on logging and palm oil industries that would discourage exploiting natural resources and establish payment for land management. Landowners should also be educated in orangutan conservation and be given recognition when they participate in the conservation of the orangutans. Biodiversity considerations should also be incorporated into any future plans, policies, and practices that relate to the environment the orangutans call habitat. Wildlife corridors should also be established over all major roads near conservation areas in order to provide access between known orangutan habitats. For the second problem of lacking of government coordination, this could be solved by increasing the number of local non-government organizations and citizen groups to work in harmony with local government policies for conversations. Then the citizen groups should be supported politically, scientifically, and financially in order to properly enable the group's conservation efforts. Public information should also be released to educate the populace on orangutans and the dangers that they face. It would also be beneficial to enlist the aid of the non-government organization Worldwide Fund for Nature. For inadequate funding for conservation activities, a solution to this problem would be raising rates for the national park admissions, lodging and facilities to match the cost of managing the conservation areas, pardon me. Examples of this are hiring more park rangers to monitor protected areas. And finally, these are the sources I used to back up the research. Thank you very much.